What's up YouTube? Today we are going to be doing a review of the Flywoo Venom H20, which is a 6-motor cinelifter. Alright, so jumping into the specs of this drone, as I alluded to before, this drone has 6 motors. So the flight controller and ESC that it formerly uses is called the Goku Hex F4, and it's a 16x16 stack. A little bit more about this stack. It is 13 amps across 6 motors, which 13 amps sounds kind of low, but you have to remember that since we have 6 motors, it's 13 amps to 6 motors as opposed to a higher amperage to only 4 motors. It also does have 6 UARTs, some hardware LEDs that are built into the board, and it supports a input voltage of 2 to 4S. So the rest of the drone, obviously, it uses the Venom frame kit. Now there are 2 versions of this frame kit. There's the analog one, which is what you're going to be seeing in this video today, and then there's also a DJI one, which I don't have, so I'm not going to comment on, but I imagine that the only differences are the camera and possibly video transmitter mounting. So as far as motors, it uses the NIN V2 1203 Pro motors at 48,500 kV. So future me here, but it turns out there was a mistake in their listing. Here you can see the page where it says that there are 48,500 kV motors, which when I read that didn't sound right, but I clicked on the link, and it turns out that it links to 4,850, like 4,850 kV motors, which makes a lot of sense. And when I'm going and grabbing my actual drone and looking at it, that seems to be what I also have. So sorry for that little mistake. Another thing to add is that there are some LEDs which you can customize in Betaflight, and as I mentioned, they're on the board, and they also put some on the arms of the drone. And it does come with a cable for an action camera. I just chopped that off because I was using DJI Action 2, which has a built-in battery. As far as props go, it uses 5-bladed props, which is interesting. And that does mean this thing is pretty loud. That's pretty standard on some Cinewhoops. The Avata also does that. And then as far as their VTX, it's the Goku VTX 625 V2, which I believe is a 600 milliwatt video transmitter despite its name. And it was pretty solid in my testing. It seemed to meet its claims, though I do not have any output power tester, so I can't really conclusively say for sure, but it seemed like a good video transmitter. I didn't have any issues with it. On their website, the listed compatibility is, as far as the external cameras that you can mount to it, is the Caddx Peanut / Insta360 Go 2, which are kind of the same thing, but the Caddx Peanut is just a stripped down version specifically designed for FPV. DJI Action 2, which I believe is the heaviest camera that is rated for this. The Smo 4K, GoPro 10 Bones, Runcam Thumb, and then Naked GoPro Hero 6 or 7s, Naked GoPro Hero 10, and the Naked GoPro Hero 9. So that's all that it says is officially compatible, though I imagine if you had a camera other than that, that probably weighs less than 100 grams, you could probably get it done, because with my camera, which is 55 grams, it still did fly pretty well. As far as the camera goes, we'll get into this later, but it uses the Ratel Baby 2. Alright, so now we're putting it up on the scale. We can see here that it weighs 128 grams dry weight. Now this does include a 3D print that I did to mounts. It's just a GoPro mount, but it also is compatible with the DJI Action mount. And that also includes, obviously, the mounts for the DJI Action 2, and also the prop guards. Now in other people's videos they didn't seem to have prop guards, but mine came with them pre-installed, so I figured I would just leave them on since I was going to be doing some flying inside anyways. Now as far as all-up weight for a flight without a camera, you can see in the background I'm using a 450 mAh 4S battery with an XT30 connector, and that brings it to 183 grams. And once we load it up with the DJI Action 2, which as I mentioned is the heaviest camera that they officially rate it for, it gets to 238 grams, so sub 250. But also if you're using a lighter camera like the Runcam Thumb or Insta360 Go 2, you could probably get away with using a bigger like 650 or 750 mAh battery with it being under 250 grams. Alright, so as you can probably tell by the title, this is going to be a test flight of the drone inside. So we're going to have 2 flights. We're going to have one without a camera, which is what you're currently seeing, and then one with a DJI Action 2 mounted on top, both with the prop guards, and not the exact same 450, but the same branded one. As you can see, it does feel pretty light without the camera, which I hope it would because the camera has a significant amount of weight. Um, the video transmitter seemed to work fine earlier. There was a little bit of breakup. And as usual, I am using a pair of Fat Shark Dominator V2s with a rapid fire module in them, and I'm just using an Omni and a patch with right hand circular polarization. But I think that might have just been some multipathing because as we get a little further and get some rooms over, everything remains fine. The voltage sag was also pretty good. It's still remaining at 3.75 volts, but it's a little bit. And you can see I have the light set to red, which you can kind of see as we get into a darker room. I was kind of hoping they would illuminate it a little bit more and maybe act as like a flashlight so I could see a little bit, but they didn't really seem to do that much. As I mentioned, you can configure the lights in Betaflight. It's pretty simple to do. There's a lot that you can control. As usual, the amperage meter didn't seem to be too well calibrated, but the ADC does seem accurate enough where you could probably calibrate it. I haven't yet. Maybe I'll release a video talking about it, but it seemed fairly accurate enough. Now, I do have this video transmitter set to max, and I'm also using ELRS, which obviously at 500 milliwatts and 50 hertz is holding up fine, just fine inside. And overall, the squad did fly pretty well. I heard some people saying that it felt different because it has 6 motors, because remember, it's not a quadcopter, it's a hexcopter technically. I didn't notice that at all. And the part 2 of this review is going to be outdoor flights. And I didn't really have any issues with outdoor flights with the yaw when you're going quicker, but inside it feels pretty normal. Since I'm just flying in angle mode, maybe that was part of it. But yeah, even getting towards about halfway through a flight here, you can see I crashed into that, the prop guards a little bit. Getting towards halfway through the flight, the throttle value, even though we're at 3.58 volts, so the voltage is sagging significantly. I mean, these are pretty old batteries. They're about over a year old at this point. And they've just been sitting at storage for most of that, honestly. But even though we're at that kind of 3.6 volt mark, it's still at around 20% throttle to hover, which, you know, as I mentioned, I would kind of hope it would be considering the fact that we're going to have to add a camera. But overall, it flew fairly well. As far as inside flying, since it does pin 2-inch props, it's fairly small. It's pretty maneuverable. I'm no Cineboot pilot inside, but this flew well enough and was nimble enough that this is my first flight with it. It just kind of worked. It wasn't too much of a struggle. But I did just bumping into stuff. The prop guards broke a little bit, but those are 3D printed and they're fairly cheap, so there's no damage to the drone at all. It wasn't that much of a big deal. But overall, I was fairly happy with how this quad flew, especially as an indoor quad. And I know it kind of looks a little shaky. That's mostly me on the sticks, but stabilization of any good camera, as we'll see in a couple minutes here, irons that out mostly. Back to how I was talking about the ADC, we could see that we're almost nearing the end of the pack, and it's only reading 139, 140 milliamp hours, which is not accurate. These batteries do in fact hold more power than that, even though they're a little bit used. But yeah, you can see it seems around the pool table there's a little bit of multipathing. That might just be because it's made out of wood. As we're nearing the end of the battery, we are in a little bit higher of a throttle position, but I mean, you can see I'm at 3.3 volts, and with a 450, they did have a 450 high volt. That really shouldn't change things too much. It means it'll be a little lighter, but they were claiming to get, I believe, 2 more minutes of flight time than I did, which I just simply did not get. But jumping into the flight with the camera here, we're immediately a little higher in the throttle, but honestly, it's fine. We're about double, so at like 20%. And I also have the audio from my DJI Action 2 camera, and this was recorded. It wasn't recorded with Horizon Steady or anything, but it was recorded with Rocksteady, which is basically it kind of irons out and smooths out the bumps that you'll see from, like, in this case, for me being not smooth on the sticks, or if this quad did have issues with tuning or prop wash, which in my experience it didn't. But if it did, then it would kind of smooth out that. Now, adding on the camera, you're going to see here shortly, the flight time was not nearly as good as you'd probably expect, adding a significant amount of weight. But if you're expecting to, fly or chase something, this probably wouldn't be the drone for that. And as you'll see in the next video when we get outside, the outside performance is actually decent. It's a lot better than I thought, but it can't keep it up for long. It doesn't have great endurance. Even just hovering inside, or I guess this isn't really hovering, but just cruising around, you can see we were a minute in, we've already sagged to like 3.5 volts, so it's not going to fly for a while. Now, as far as setting it up in beta flight, everything with the flight controller seemed fine. I didn't have to do anything with that. The props came pre-installed. The prop guards came pre-installed as well. So there were no issues at all with any of that. Overall, it was a very smooth experience. Now, this is one thing I noticed with all Flywoo drones. The Flywoo drones generally contain Flywoo flight controllers, and they all overheat really easily. Like, if you let it sit for like the 30-ish, 40-ish seconds, it'll be at like 70, 80 degrees Celsius according to maybe their temperature sensors are just off, but I noticed that especially with this drone and then their baby Nano 20, the 2S version. I don't notice it as bad with my Flywoo Explorer, but there have been times where it does overheat. I have to go and put a fan to it before it gets a GPS lock, which is always kind of annoying. But yeah, we're nearing the end of our flight. I'm still kind of pushing it a little because I know the battery's just sagging because we're at twice the throttle we were before. Because once again, we're carrying a camera. But overall, it did produce a pretty smooth flight. And yeah, you can see we had a little crash there as well. That's what broke part of the prop guard and kind of got it stuck in the prop. But as we're coming in for landing, you can see we got about 2.5 minutes. They didn't give any formal ratings for battery life or flight time for when you do have a camera attached. But they said 7 minutes and 20 seconds when you don't. I didn't get that. Make of that what you will. My batteries are a little old, but I don't know. It seems a little fishy. But they didn't even say anything about how it would fly when you don't have a camera attached, or when you do have a camera attached. But overall, I would say this drone flew pretty well. Indoors, I mean, I wasn't flying super quick. Obviously, I wasn't flying like it was a tiny loop. I was just kind of cruising around. And it did everything I'd expect. The range and penetration seemed fairly well. I might do a separate range and penetration test later, flying through multiple floors. Like if you're trying to do like a one-take fly through of a house across multiple floors. I imagine it would do all right because the video transmitter is fairly powerful and it seems to perform fairly well. Same with the ELRS. Once again, I was using a 500 milliwatt transmitter, and there were no issues there. But overall, it flew pretty well. I think with the lights, it also looks pretty cool. The lights were very bright, very visible. In the next part, I might add a shot of that because it does look pretty cool and you can customize it to any color you want. The only main gripe I had about this drone was the price, which it was, I believe, $240, which isn't horrible, but I guess it's kind of just because it's kind of a niche because it's 6 motors and you need a special ESC for that, which they had to design, so there's probably overhead with that. But the only part of it that I really didn't like were the proprietary propellers. They performed fine, but finding those, there's not going to be many manufacturers who make propellers with that many blades of that tiny size. There just aren't going to be a lot of them on the market. And then also the camera, that's the main thing I really didn't like. Now in the indoor flights, I don't know if you noticed it, but they got kind of a fisheye going on, which means that it can be kind of difficult to judge and perceive distance from things. In the inside, it's actually not that bad, so if you're doing slow flying, but as we'll see in the next video when we get outside, it was kind of bad. But as far as cinelifters go, the price isn't a horrible issue because many cinelifters cost thousands and thousands. As far as drones that are 2 inch in size and that can carry not a full-sized camera, but not a stripped down camera either, just like a standard DJI Action 2 at 55 grams. I don't really know of any other 2 inch drones that can comfortably do it. Now, of course, you could probably strap it to one and it would probably hover, but it wouldn't fly great. Um, I did put it back on my Cinelog 25. The ESC exploded, so obviously I haven't gotten around to fixing that. Um, but back when it did work, I did put this camera on it, and it flew all right, but it didn't fly as well as this. And that had 1404 motors also on for us with the same batteries actually. Um, but this actually got more flight time. Um, the other one got around 3 minutes without a camera and around like 2 with. Um, this one got more flight time. It flies a lot better with the camera. That one you couldn't. There was no power. You're probably hovering at 60% throttle. Whereas this one, it was a lot better. So if your main goal is going to be flying inside or outside, but not at a crazy fast speed with a camera, and you want something in a small size, this would be it. It is a little noisy, but it does handle the camera exceptionally well for its size, and that's because it has 6 motors, and 6 motored quadcopters handle weight better. So that explains why you would get more flight time and more efficiency and the ability to perform better with that added payload simply because it has 6 motors. And there are, of course, trade-offs, associated with that. The frame design is a little weird. The ESC is proprietary. If the ESC exploded, which obviously I'm purely speculating because mine is fine, but let's say it did eventually, because these things don't last forever, you'd have to get Flywoo's one because, 16 amp, or 13 amp, 16 by 16, 6 motor ESCs are very rare, especially one that would be compatible with this flight control. So you're kind of stuck into their system, their set of boards, which I'm not a huge fan of. But honestly, it's probably fine because you're not going to be crashing this a ton. It is a Cinelifter, so theoretically you shouldn't be crashing it at all, but no one's a perfect pilot. Um, but overall, I think for indoor flying, this drone is very competent, and I would definitely recommend it. In the next video, we'll get to outdoor flying, so stay tuned for that. And if you could, please subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.